The first data structure that we're going to take a look at is also one of the more straightforward ones. So we're going to get a nice, gentle introduction to data structures here. In this video, we're going to start to discuss queues. So let's take a look at what a queue is. A queue can be thought of as like a container of sorts, where records or pieces of data enter on one end of this container and then exit on the other. You can really think of a queue as being very much like waiting in line to buy tickets from some ticketing counter, like for a train or for tickets from the movie theater. In this example, you can imagine that the line of people waiting to get to the ticketing counter is very much like a queue, because a person will enter into the line at the very end, then they have to wait in the line until it's their turn to emerge from it and approach the ticketing counter. In a queue, there's no idea of skipping or cutting in line. So the order in which you get into this queue also dictates the order in which you come out. The process of adding a record into a queue is referred to as enqueuing, or adding a record. And then taking something out from the other end is thought of as dequeuing or removing a record. You'll see these terms used interchangeably. Now, I want to expand on what we spoke about just a second ago with maintaining order in a queue. So a queue follows what we refer to as a first in, first out principle, or abbreviated FIFO. FIFO if you feel like it, I don't know. So let's imagine this step by step. Let's start out up here with nothing in the queue. So we've got two records right here outside the queue, and we want to add record A into the queue. So here we just added A. A is now sitting in the queue by itself. And then in this next step, we can insert B or add B into the queue. Now, when we attempt to remove a record, the first thing that is always going to come out will be record A. So the first record that goes into the queue is also going to be the first one that comes out. And that's why we call it first in, first out. Now, here's the interesting part about queues that's very closely related to what we spoke about just a moment ago with how JavaScript natively implements a lot of these data structures. So in an interview setting, if an interviewer says to you, hey, implement a queue for me, or if you start working on an algorithm and you realize, oh, a queue would be really helpful here, remember that when we are working with JavaScript, we really don't have such a thing as a rudimentary queue. We have JavaScript arrays, which are super hyper functional in nature. They've got a ton of different methods attached to them, a ton of different ways of interacting with them. Whereas a queue has just this tiny little API attached to it. We really just have the ability to add records in and pull records out on the other side. So again, this is the part where in the last video I said that this gets a little bit weird. In JavaScript, when we want to implement a queue, usually what we end up doing is taking an array and then restricting the methods that can be used to interact with that array. So if you really think about it, a JavaScript array, adding an item to the very front of an array with JavaScript is done by using the unshift method. And then removing something from the end of an array is done by using the pop method. So a very common way of implementing a queue would be to do something like this right here. We might make a queue class, like an ES 2015 class. Inside of that class, we will initialize an empty array. Now this array has all these different methods associated with it. It has all the capabilities in the world. But to make sure that it's really clear that we are producing a queue, and so it's something that should be interacted with only as a queue should be, we will usually only expose the unshift and pop methods outside of the class. So in other words, whenever we make a queue with JavaScript, we usually make an array, but we do our best to hide access to all these methods that belong to the array. So your immediate question here might be, Stephen, why in the world would we do that? Why would we take an array and purposefully kind of handicap it here and remove some of the methods? Well, there's two answers to that. On the one hand, in an interview setting, it's kind of obvious. If your interviewer says, make a queue, well, we're going to make a queue and we're going to do whatever they say. The other reason for kind of hiding the functionality of an array in more of a practical setting or like on a real project, maybe imagine for a second you are working on some complicated problem and you want to solve the problem with an algorithm using a queue. And you realize that if you use a queue, it will be a fantastic algorithm, like the best one in the world possible for solving this problem. But if you interact with that queue as though it were an array, then all of a sudden the performance of that goes downhill. So one possible reason to use a queue and try to obfuscate all the other methods that an array has would be to make sure that if some other engineer came and started looking at your algorithm sometime in the future, they wouldn't go like, oh, this is an array, I could just treat it like an array and reorder the elements inside of it, or remove the first element out of it, or whatever it might be. So in the real world, if we want to create a queue class, yeah, we will still use an array behind the scenes and limit access to the methods on it. And the idea there is that if we make a queue, it's because we very specifically want to use a queue and don't want to treat it like an array. So that's just one possible example. Okay, so here's the idea behind a queue. We are going to make a queue from scratch. We are going to make a queue, and we should be able to create a new one by calling something like this right here, new queue. We should be able to add a record to the queue by calling some add method associated to it. And then we should be able to remove records or dequeue records from it by calling some method called queue.remove. So I'm going to make sure that in the next video, when we start this exercise, we'll put this documentation into the actual document that we're going to be working on. But just to be clear, this is essentially what we're going to try to create by making a queue. Okay, so quick break, and we will continue in the next video.